Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you guys some really awesome audiobook recommendations. I was looking at my reading spreadsheet the other day and I realized that I've read almost every single book this year on audio, which has been so amazing for my brain because I have really bad headaches and migraines consistently, and I also have a very bad attention span, so listening to books as opposed to physically reading really helps me get through reading a book because I don't get distracted very easily. My eyes are not jumping over the pages, I'm not getting headaches and migraines. They are just a lifesaver. You know, like, if you're somebody who relies on audiobooks, you're going to understand what I'm saying, and you're also going to agree with me when I say that listening to audiobooks is just as valuable as reading a book physically because we love accessibility. Okay, some really awesome places to listen to audiobooks are Libby, Hoopla, and Overdrive, which are all free if you have a library card, and if your library partners with any of those apps or companies. You can also get audiobooks on Scribd, which I believe is $9.99 every single month, so you can have basically an unlimited selection every month for $9.99, and I do have a link down below so you guys can get 60 days for free and I get 30 days. We all win, but you can use that. There are a lot of ways to finesse Scribd if you want to know. You just don't save the audiobook, just listen to the audiobook, click out don't save it, and it will keep it saved for you. Okay, I'm telling you the hack right now. Okay, hopefully Scribd doesn't find this video because it's not sponsored, so they won't find it. Okay, also, if you want to buy the audiobooks, you can get your audiobooks from Libro FM, which I believe a part of the money you spend on the audiobook goes to independent bookstores. So that's a really great way to support independent bookstores, especially right now with what's going on in the world. That's a really amazing way to support bookstores that may be struggling. Or if your only option is Audible, you can of course also get Audible. I'm pretty sure there are probably other resources as well. I know that on Spotify,
there are some audiobooks that you can listen to.
Like, I believe The Raven Cycle is on Spotify, and then it's also on YouTube, and there are audiobooks on YouTube as well. So there are a lot of different ways that you can find audiobooks. Now that that's done and out of the way, let's talk about the books that I recommend. The first audiobook I want to recommend is The Astonishing Color of After. This book follows our main character, who is half Taiwanese and half white, and her mother at the beginning of the book commits suicide, and our main character travels to Taiwan because she believes that her mother has turned into a bird. I really loved the audiobook for this book because in the book there are a lot of Mandarin phrases that I otherwise would not have known how to pronounce. Like, she uses Mandarin phrases for when speaking to her grandparents, to address her grandparents, and I just really loved and appreciated hearing what those words sounded like, because sometimes when you are reading a book that is from a different culture that you're not from, that also has its own language, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out what those words sound like, how they're pronounced, things like that. And I did read an article of the author talking about the Mandarin phrases and talking about the use of language when writing this book and how language really forms and shapes the way we think of things. And I just really loved that article, so I will link that down below. But I loved this book so much. It is definitely really painful, so trigger warnings for depression and suicide, but I just felt like the audiobook was definitely the way to go for this book because you just feel so connected to the main character and to everything happening in the book through the audiobook. The next book that I want to recommend is Becoming by Michelle Obama. This is no surprise to anyone, but I absolutely adore this book. This is Michelle Obama's memoir, and we basically follow Michelle from her childhood up until after the presidency, and you really get to find out about Michelle's life and how she got to where she was before meeting Barack, and how their relationship transformed before, during, and after the presidency, and of course her children, and how she felt throughout all these processes. I love the audiobook for this. First of all, most of the time with nonfiction, I just feel like it's better on audio, especially because usually, from what I have noticed and seen, the writer is also the narrator, and I feel like listening to an audiobook from somebody who's telling you about their life, because most of actually all the nonfiction books that I have read are memoirs, autobiographies, things like that. And it's amazing to hear the person who wrote this say these words to you. And I really, really, really recommend Becoming, because it's just such an important story for Black women, for Black people, for people of color, women of color, things like that. Even if you're not a woman of color or a person of color, this is definitely something that you need to read because it is so enlightening. This is the first nonfiction book that I had ever read, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I cried so much. It was phenomenal. Okay, hearing Michelle say these words to me, that she said, the encouraging words that she says in the book, hearing it from her mouth with her voice just really makes you feel seen and understood, and like you're getting a warm hug. And it was just amazing. All the books in this list are amazing. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The next book I have is The Henna Artist, which is a book that follows our main character Lakshmi, who has run away from her hometown and from a bad marriage because she got married around the age of 17, and so she has escaped that toxic situation and she moves to a big city where later on she becomes a henna artist as well as an advisor to rich families. This audiobook was wow. Like, I read the book and listened to the audiobook at the same time, but I was mainly on the audiobook. If you don't speak Hindi, you're hearing these words in a language that you don't speak, and it's just so amazing to hear what these words actually sound like, and it just makes you really appreciate and wonder and be amazed by the power of language. As Emily XR Pan said, language is just so powerful. The next book that I want to recommend is the Lunar Chronicles, which is a young adult science fiction series, and I absolutely love this series. So it follows 4 retellings. So we have Cinder for Cinderella, we have Scarlet for Red Riding Hood, we have Cress for Rapunzel, and then we have Winter for Snow White. I really, really, really love this series. It is a very wholesome found family type of series, and I don't typically care about the found family trope. Not that I don't care, but it's not something that typically makes me feel like, oh, I feel seen or I love this so much. But in the Lunar Chronicles, you're seeing how all these characters who are displaced in different ways find each other. It's just so wonderful. And I did try to read the series physically as well, but I was just so stuck on the audiobook and how the narrator really brought these characters to life in a new way, because the writing itself is really, really good regardless. But I just feel like the audiobooks are amazing, especially if you're a beginner to science fiction or fantasy or things like that. I feel like this is the perfect series for you to try, especially if you're trying to get into audiobooks. If you're kind of on the fence and you're like, I don't really know if I like audiobooks, this is a great one to start with. I typically am like, is this fantasy, is this science fiction? But I've heard people say both, and I like to go with science fiction because I feel like the elements in the series are very, very science fiction. So we'll leave it at that. And we'll move on to the next one. The next book on my list is Daisy Jones and the Six, which follows a fictional band from the 70s that is now over, and they are being interviewed about all the things that happened while they were in the height of their fame up until when their band disbanded and things went down. I'm recommending this one not because I enjoyed it, because it's definitely not a book that I personally liked, but the audiobook was amazing. Honestly, Daisy Jones and the Six is one of the best audiobooks I think I have ever listened to, because it is a full cast. The audiobook is so good, and you really get that 70s vibe. You really feel like you're actually there, because there's moments in the past where, you know, Daisy and the band members are kind of like talking and things like that, and you just kind of feel like you're there with them. So this is definitely one of those audiobooks that will make you feel like you're actually talking to a whole bunch of people. So if you like something that feels very, very real, I would say Daisy Jones is one to try out, especially if you do like stories about famous people and you kind of want an interview-esque podcast type of book. You will really love the audiobook for this one. Next is one of my all-time favorite books ever, and that is Radio Silence. Radio Silence is a book that follows our main character, Frances, who is a big fan of a podcast called Universe City. And she ends up connecting with the creator of the podcast, and they invite her to become an artist for the podcast, and she becomes friends with the creator, and things happen from there. Frances is one of those people who is just perfect at school, but she doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life. This is a YA contemporary novel. So we're following Frances among other students who are trying to figure out what to do with their life, how to make their identities be more than being students or not being students, things like that. This book on audio is wonderful, especially because of the podcast element. Like I said, Frances is a huge fan of University, so she is listening to the podcast, and the podcast little fragments get thrown into the story. And while I read this book initially physically, I then reread it this year on audio, and
I read it both times.
I reread it in August on audio, and it was just phenomenal. It was so good. I was not disappointed, because something I do get nervous about is rereading a book, which I don't really do often, but rereading a book on a different medium than when I first read it. So if I read something physically, I get nervous to read it on audio, and if I read something on audio, I get nervous to read it physically, as evident in my failure of rereading the Lunar Chronicles physically. It's fine. But anyways, the podcast element of this book is awesome. If you are somebody who loves podcasts, you're gonna really love this. I have heard a lot of other people mention podcasts like books being perfect for audio, but Radio Silence is the only one right now that I have read that had a podcast element. So I will get back to you all on that one. Maybe we'll have a part 2 in 2021. We'll see. The next book on this list is also not going to be a surprise to anyone, but it's The Poet X. The Poet X is a novel in verse that follows our main character, Xiomara, who is a poet, and she wants to write poetry and write about her feelings, her emotions, her struggles, things like that. But Xiomara comes from a very devout Catholic household, and she is not allowed to express these things, and that's basically what the novel in verse goes over, and the things that happen while she's trying to discover herself and who she is. This book is so painful, and it's wonderful. It's the best on audio, especially because the author, Elizabeth Acevedo, who is one of my favorite authors ever, literally narrates the audiobook. And when I tell you, chef's kiss, I really mean it. Elizabeth is a poet through and through, and you can really feel that in the way she talks about the things going on in the book, the way she enunciates certain phrases and certain paragraphs and certain lines. It's just so wonderful, and it makes you feel so emotional. Again, going back to the language thing, there are Spanish words and phrases from what I remember in this book, and it's just really great to hear Elizabeth Acevedo, who is Latinx. She's Afro-Latinx, and it's really great to hear her say those words by herself on the audiobook, and like to hear the person who created these wonderful words say them to you. Okay, it's giving me the Becoming by Michelle Obama vibes. Okay, wonderful stuff. Now we are going to go into the final book for this video, and that is The Diviners, which is a book that follows our main character, Evie, who has been kicked out of her home and has to move to New York to be with her uncle, I believe. I can't remember, but she gets kicked out of her like very like small town to go to New York, where she now has to kind of like discover herself, find herself, whatever. And there are a group of other people there who have this power called divining, and they basically see some really scary stuff. Okay, it's weird, and Evie is one of them. This book is so spooky and so creepy and so perfect for any time you want to read something scary and horror. But the audiobook, okay, is honestly, I think, the best audiobook I've ever listened to. Like, up until this point, it's the best audiobook ever. I will say that with my whole chest. It's the best audiobook I have ever listened to thus far, because this book is narrated by one person. One person narrates this whole book, but they sound like 12 people at the same time. It's so crazy. Like, the narrator is so good at sounding like every single one of these characters. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of ambiance, there's a lot of really weird, creepy songs in the book that the narrator just lands so perfectly. And if you're looking for something that's going to really creep you out, you have to listen to The Diviners, because it's so good. It made me so scared to like fall asleep, and I don't even know if reading it physically would have done that, but the audiobook definitely did. So spooky vibes and audiobooks are your thing. You need to try out The Diviners, because it's so good. And if you have listened to Diviners, do you agree with me? Because like, I want to know if you agree with me, because I was just floored by the talent in that audiobook. It was just magnificent. All right, those are all the audiobook recommendations I have for now. We'll see if there'll ever be a part 2. But yes, that's everything. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you watched to the end of the video, leave me a coffee emoji or a tea emoji, or just write coffee because I'm always drinking coffee, so perhaps we'll go with coffee. Leave me a coffee emoji and let me know if you've read any of these audiobooks, listened to any of these audiobooks, or if you plan to. I will see you guys in the next video. Have a wonderful day.